Welcome, everyone, and thank you for attending the latest in a series of public events by the Michael V. Hayden Center for Intelligence, Policy, and International Security. I am Mark Rozelle. I serve as the Dean of the Schar School of Policy and Government at George Mason University, and we are proud to host the Hayden Center. Tonight, we have over 300 persons signed up from all over the United States and internationally, and we are live on our YouTube channel as well. We have participants from 32 states and the District of Columbia, as well as 23 countries and 5 continents, and also from 13 colleges and universities. We have a good many students here from George Mason University. The Hayden Center, of course, honors its founder, General Michael V. Hayden, who is with us this evening. The Hayden Center is part of a larger security studies emphasis in the Schar School of Policy and Government. Our International Security Studies master's degree program has been a top 10 ranked national program for 4 years running in U.S. News and World Report. And we are fortunate to have many leading scholars and practitioner teachers in our International Security Studies master's degree program. Among our practitioner faculty members are General Hayden himself, who has been with the Schar School now for 12 years, Michael Morrell, the past deputy director and twice acting director of the CIA, David Priest, the publisher and COO of Lawfare, who is moderating tonight, and Ronald Marks, a past Senate liaison to 5 directors of the CIA. So if you have an interest in security studies, the Schar School really is the place to be. Beginning next fall, we will have a new undergraduate degree program in international security and law. It is now my honor to turn over the program to the namesake of our center, General Michael Hayden. General?
Good evening. I'm really looking forward to this. You know, I was at CIA almost 3 years, and I think I know much about the CIA, but there's a lot I don't know. So I'm looking forward to this discussion now. Larry, over to you.
Thank you very much, General Hayden. And I think a lot of people will say that those 3 years may have been some of the best years at CIA. Welcome, everybody, again tonight. We're back to doing an all virtual event, so we're glad to see our international audience joining us again, as well as those who are even closer to home. For those who aren't familiar with the Hayden Center, we were stood up 5 years ago, almost to the day. We're here to put a spotlight on intelligence and the role it plays in supporting policymakers. We do that largely through events like tonight's featuring prominent experts. If you want to know about our events first, join our mailing list. You can do that by going to the Hayden Center website. And on the right-hand side, there's a box. You enter your email address, hit enter, and you'll be hearing about our events first. If you also want to know what's going on with the Hayden Center or what we're thinking about, follow us on social media. We've got Twitter accounts, Facebook account, LinkedIn account. We have a channel on YouTube as well, where we have all of the presentations we have done over the last 5 years. We're live streaming the event, as Mark mentioned, and recording the event, so it will be available immediately afterwards for a rewatch, or if you want to recommend it to your friends after watching such a splendid evening. The time for questions, there will be time for questions tonight. We would ask you to use the Q&A tool in Zoom, available usually at the bottom of your screen, to put your questions. Don't put your questions in the chat. We may not see it, but if you want to chat with others who are watching the event, the chat is open for your discussion and conversations. Ask you to keep the questions brief and put them in the form of a question. If you just want to give us a little lecture about CIA and its history, probably not going to read it over the air. We're looking for your questions. If you want to let us know who you are, that's always wonderful. We'll mention your name, your affiliation. But if you prefer to remain anonymous, either let us know or just check the little anonymous box on the Q&A question. Tonight's event, we are honoring, celebrating, commemorating, denoting the 75th anniversary of CIA. So we as human beings like to note these weird numbered birthdays for some strange reason, but it's probably for the same reason humans have liked to tell stories since the earliest days. You know, cavemen gathered around the fire and told stories about their daily exploits. Over time, those collections of stories became histories. Histories became important to cultures because they established the facts about what the country did, what the society did. We use history to educate ourselves. We use it to inform our present. We use it to guide our future. Now, that's difficult to do when everything you do is secret. And in the intelligence business, everything is secret. There's a lot of great internal histories, but what we've learned, Americans and other free societies, the people, they really dislike a couple of things. They dislike extreme secrecy and they dislike extreme power. Well, the intelligence community's got a lot of both. As our societies become more open, in order to develop and broker a trust with the public, the IC has recognized the need to be more transparent. How do we do that? Well, we do that through telling history, because if we tell you what we're doing today, we're likely to compromise sources and methods that prevent us from creating that wonderful intelligence for our policymakers. Tonight, we have brought together a panel of experts to examine the last 75 years of CIA's history and then discuss a bit, how that informs us as we move forward, how it informs our operations today, and how it informs our movements going forward. We have tonight on our panel Sarah Jane Corke. Sarah Jane Corke is the co-founder and past president of the North American Society for Intelligence History. I like to joke, intelligence history, it's a tough job. So the society was probably brought together so they could all sit and drink martinis, shaken, not stirred, and commiserate about how they can't get information out of these intelligence agencies. She is also an associate professor at the history of the University of New Brunswick, where she is coming in tonight. She and her colleague are actually our first foreign guests who are coming in from their foreign countries. So that's kind of exciting for us tonight. She's the author of a book on CIA covert action history. And she's co-editor of the upcoming book, Inside the Wilderness of Mirrors, Historians and the International Spy Museum. Also joining us is Rhodri Jeffreys-Jones. Rhodri is a professor of American history emeritus at the University of Edinburgh. He is coming into us from Scotland tonight. So thank you very much, because I believe it's a little bit after midnight there. So I appreciate you staying up to the bewitching hour and joining us for this conversation. Rhodri is an authority on American intelligence history. He's written many books on this topic, including the just released book, A Question of Standing, The History of the CIA, which the timing couldn't be more impeccable as people are writing about the 75th anniversary. I wish you great success with the new book. Our moderator is David Priest. David is publisher and chief operating officer, publisher of Lawfare and chief operating officer of the Lawfare Institute. Lawfare is the online and podcast source of national security information and insight. Encourage you to, if you're not subscribing, go subscribe and follow them. They offer some great insights. Just before this event, I was watching them as they discussed what they thought of today's hearing about January 6th, for example. David hosts Chatter, which is a relatively new podcast. He co-hosts it with Shane Harris of the Washington Post. It's a bit of an esoteric thing, but they do often talk about intelligence and national security issues. David serves as a senior fellow at the Hayden Center and is a visiting professor at the Schar School of Policy and Government. So I will, with that, wish happy birthday to CIA, and I will turn it over to David, Sarah Jane, and Rhodri for what should be an interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Larry. We have 75 minutes for this entire program, and we had one idea, which is to take 1 minute for each year of the CIA's history and just shout out random words relating to that year. And upon further reflection, we decided that we probably should be slightly more focused, but we're still going to progress somewhat chronologically through the CIA's history, hitting some high points, some low points, and some lessons for the future. I'd like to start appropriately with the beginning. Sarah Jane, walk us through Harry Truman's mindset as he essentially reversed his earlier decision to walk back wartime intelligence structures in the United States and actually create the Central Intelligence Agency in 1947.
Well, the first thing I want to say is that when we talk about the CIA in particular, when we talk about intelligence agencies in general, we like to pretend that they exist in a vacuum, but they don't. So the history of the CIA is really the history of the American government, and it's the history of the United States. So we want to understand why the CIA was founded and the way it was founded. Then we need to ask, what was Harry Truman's mindset at the time? And in order to do that, we need to pull the camera out a bit and look at what was happening in the United States. The CIA was part of a larger remaking of the American government that was outlined in the National Security Act, which was formed in 1947. This included the National Security Council, the Department of Defense. It also provided for an independent Air Force. This is important because it suggests that the government believed that a new type of bureaucracy was necessary to deal with the issues of the second half of the 20th century. Why? Because they believed the government had not functioned as well as it could have during World War II. And second, there was a new threat emerging on the other side of the world. As a result, there was a consensus that the United States needed some type of post-war intelligence capability. The key issue was what kind? And this is a very significant question because it brings us face to face with one of the big debates amongst American historians. Historians on the traditional side tend to argue that the United States didn't want a post-war intelligence capability, and that when Truman shut down the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, it was because he did not want an American Gestapo. This argument is grounded in the assumption that the United States was not the type of country that needed or wanted a post-war intelligence capability. However, I want to suggest this wasn't the case. What Truman didn't want was Wild Bill Donovan. Donovan had headed the OSS. The irony was that although Truman was successful in getting rid of Donovan, a lot of the people who worked for him moved from the OSS through to the CIA. So while Truman did not have Donovan, he certainly had to contend with what I would call the Donovan tradition. This was a tradition that favored daring do, a certain type of cowboy attitude of coloring outside the lines, and this tradition would continue to affect the organization throughout its history.
With that, we have a bit of the flavor on the executive branch side and the overall American side, but Rhodri, you've made the point that the CIA's legislative foundation was special and, in fact, crucial. Why does that foundation, that standing, to use a word from the subtitle of your new book, how does that legislative foundation provide a special standing, and why does it matter?
Well, that legislative foundation was unique. No other country had established a democratically approved intelligence agency. Scandinavian countries had a tradition of open government going back to the 18th century, but that didn't apply to their intelligence services. And looking at the history of the United States, the Secret Service, the FBI, none of the other agencies had received congressional consent. And it's important, that congressional consent. As Sarah Jane was saying, there was a fear of an American Gestapo, perhaps based on a misunderstanding of what the Gestapo was, because the Gestapo was mainly domestic, but there was a fear that if you had one super agency which oversaw intelligence, both foreign and domestic, this would be a threat to civil liberties. And that led to the restriction of the CIA to foreign intelligence, whereas the FBI had the domestic remit. Secondly, I think when you look at the congressional debate that led to the enactment of the law, which included provision for the CIA, the emphasis is on Pearl Harbor. There's no mention of the Soviet Union or the developing Cold War at all. As Susan Mary mentioned, from the government's point of view, from the Truman administration's point of view, this was not the case. They were very much concerned with the Soviet Union, but Congress was not. It was Pearl Harbor. Many of them had direct experience of Pearl Harbor through relatives and constituents and so on. Now, I think that's significant because had the CIA been formed exclusively as a Cold War institution solely for the purpose of combating the Soviet Union, it would indeed have become defunct around the year 1990 when communism collapsed in Europe. And finally, I'd like to say that I think that congressional approval for the CIA gave it a special authority and standing in American life. It meant that presidents had to listen, which they did by and large, to what the CIA had to say. But also it was a point of vulnerability because having been established democratically, the agency always remained at the beck and call of the American people and had to meet with their approval.
It's also good that you provide that foundation, because there are echoes throughout the 75 years of differing views of the executive and Congress on exactly what CIA should be doing and how. And it's fascinating to know that's baked in from the beginning with the different ideas about what it should be doing. Let's get to some of the agency's substantive work once it is created. Sarah Jane, you've done extensive research and writing in particular on Truman and covert action. What were his views on covert action? How did they evolve during his presidency and even beyond? And what precedent did he establish for future presidents to follow?
Thanks, Dave. That's a great question. Do you mind if I just take 2 seconds and respond to Rhodri, though?
Absolutely.
I agree with him that Pearl Harbor was critical to the formation of the CIA, and it played a huge role in the analytical branch. But I also believe that through the Strategic Services Unit, which was an organization that existed between the OSS and the CIA, where more of psychological warfare, morale operations types activities were carried over, those operations were kept in place because of Russia. So I think there's a couple of different arguments for the formation of the CIA, and it does depend on which topic that you're looking at. Now, in terms of American covert operations, again, this is not an easy question because it depends on what you think of Harry Truman, right? Generally, when we think of American presidents, we tend to think of them historically, are they effective as American presidents? And historians disagree on whether American presidents were effective. For example, Rhodri in his new book suggests that Truman was an effective president. I believe Rhodri would argue that Truman accomplished quite a bit during his presidency. He accomplished the national security architecture that I mentioned earlier. He helped Europe recover from World War II. He developed the Marshall Plan, NATO, the creation of the CIA. And all of these suggest that he was very effective in putting in place the bureaucratic process to wage the Cold War. However, I argue that Truman was not as successful, especially when we get down to the nitty-gritty questions of covert operations. And I believe that he didn't put in place the mechanisms necessary to govern the CIA when controversial questions of policy and strategy came up. Truman essentially failed to resolve them. So while he set up a process, there was no follow-through. And his failure to resolve questions over policy and strategy gave the Office of Policy Coordination, which was this office in the CIA that was actually charged with conducting covert operations, a very wide latitude through which they could conduct these types of campaigns. And it was Dwight Eisenhower, I would argue, who was elected in 1952, who had to come in and clean up Truman's mess. A second point I want to address, if I have time, is why did Truman decide to adopt covert operations? Why did the Truman administration decide to adopt covert operations? And here again, I point to another, I guess, argument between Rhodri and myself. Rhodri believes that external factors, again, this goes to our debate over Pearl Harbor, the Soviet Union, were the primary determinant behind adopting covert operations. And he makes this argument in his great book. I argue that the answer is a little bit more complex, and we should look at more internal factors, like, for example, American ideology and the personalities of those involved in crafting these operations. For example, in terms of personality, I believe that one of the reasons, and I believe the most important reason, to be frank, behind the expansion of American covert operations in 1948, and here I'm talking about expansion from psychological warfare through covert operations, was a personality issue between the Director of Central Intelligence at the time, Roscoe Hillenkoetter, and the Director of Policy Planning staff at the time within the State Department, George Kennan. So it was not so much the Soviet threat that led to the expansion of American covert operations, but a bureaucratic conflict between the CIA and the State Department.
Well, if I
Thank you
could,
for that. I very much appreciate it. And Rhodri, I'd like to hear your perspective on this. And in that perspective, if you can build in a little bit more about the analytic function, because it is during Harry Truman's presidency that the core function of analysis is really operating and getting its legs too. So if you could hit your reaction to Sarah Jane's comments, but make sure to build in some analysis as well.
Okay. Yeah, I think that some background factors need to be taken into account in explaining the rise of covert operations. One of them is the Montevideo Conference of 1933, which consisted of the American states, at which all the participating states, including the United States and Franklin D. Roosevelt, agreed that they would no longer intervene internally in each other's affairs, which meant that the era of gunboat diplomacy was over. You couldn't send the Marines in anymore. And that worked reasonably well during the 1930s. Perhaps Roosevelt was lucky. He didn't have any major problems to deal with. But once the Cold War started, then the United States saw a pressing need to intervene in the affairs of some countries in the Western Hemisphere and indeed elsewhere. And covert methods of doing that suddenly had a strong attraction. And secondly, the United Nations, formed in San Francisco in 1945 and having its headquarters in New York, had as an element in its charter the abolition of war as a means of achieving diplomatic goals. And very few countries indeed have declared war since 1945. But several countries, not just the United States, have resorted to more clandestine ways of achieving their goals. Looking at the foundations of analysis in the CIA's early years, I think one does look to the OSS and the building up of the research and analysis unit there under the leadership of William Langer, who was a gifted historian from Harvard University. I think that the full benefit of RNA wasn't felt in the course of the war. It was an overlooked institution, but the expertise established, the methodological approach, such as taking an area studies approach to the different countries of the world, stood the analysts in good stead when many of them were transferred thereafter to the CIA and made up the unit called the Office of National Estimates, or ONE. And of course, the United States was a world power. And if you're studying CIA history, you're studying world history. There's a CIA presence in every country. And it did make sense to draw together all kinds of specialists from different academic disciplines to study particular countries. Another aspect of the, yes, of course, as most people know, William Langer then played a role in the establishment of ONE and was succeeded by another very able person, Sherman Kent, who is also an authority on the theory of intelligence. So there was very good leadership there at the beginning. One of the issues that I found interesting was the question of whether the CIA should be focused on the elimination of surprise attack or whether it should take a longer term view of events. And of course, there was a great demand for preventing future surprise attacks because of the Pearl Harbor experience. And the philosopher Wilmore Kendall, who'd been in OSS and was now making his views felt at the time of the establishment of the CIA, published an article which was quite critical of the idea that the agency should restrict itself to trying to foretell very short-term problems that the country might come across. Agency should be charged with anticipating longer-term events as well, and that indeed became part of the agency's remit. moving to the 1950s, I think everybody realizes that the CIA developed very good technology, which helped the analysts a great deal. It was difficult to get humans going in closed societies, such as the Soviet Union, and the development of overhead reconnaissance through the U-2 aircraft project supervised by Richard Bissell, and then the satellites program, the Corona fleet, and so on, helped to get over that difficulty and proved to be vitally important on a number of occasions. And one of the things that I found very impressive, and perhaps it hasn't had quite so much attention, is the development from 1950 onwards of an economic analysis expertise, which meant that you looked at not just what the Soviet Union could produce in terms of bombers and intercontinental ballistic missiles, but you also looked at whether they could afford to build them in any substantial numbers. And I think that that is one of the great services performed by the CIA in the 1950s and led to the dismantling of the bomber myth and of the bomber gap, rather, and the missile gap. So that those are contributions. And if you actually read the speeches of Alan Dulles, he has quite a sophisticated grasp, derived no doubt from the work of his analysts, on what the Soviet economy was like. It looked very impressive because it was expanding very rapidly, but he noted that this was from a small base, and this is what you expect in countries which are in a period of industrial takeoff. So he said, yes, it looks alarming, but don't be too alarmed because the system is basically inefficient and they're not producing all that much. Another interesting feature of that analysis was the fact that you couldn't conduct a debate in terms of rubles because rubles have an artificial value. And so they developed algorithms to tackle that question. I thought all that was very impressive in the early period of CIA analysis.
It is interesting that even from the beginning, or very close to the beginning, I mean, we're going back 75 years now, and you can look at the early analysis and recognize very clearly the analysis that the CIA is doing today. That is, at the highest level, analysts are putting together information. They are getting it to the President of the United States in a format that he can read. Harry Truman got his daily summary, and you can say, wow, we as American intelligence professionals had a system in place almost from the beginning that has a sense of continuity for 75 years. Of course, as a historian, you can also look back at those copies of the Daily Summary and the other intelligence products that got up to the president in the late 1940s and early 1950s and almost shake your head at them because the analysts themselves did not have access to all sources of intelligence. They were very simple in many ways. There was no analytic rigor put into the writing. Even if some of the thinking had some rigor, it was not reflected in the writing itself. And you could take two very different lessons away from that, like what a system and how well it was established, or it really wasn't well done back then. Sarah Jane, I'd like your reflections on that before I hit you with a question that makes us move a little bit forward in time as well.
Well, a couple of points, just shout out to you and your work. It's been one of the most influential books on American intelligence analysis that I've read in the last few years. I use it in all of my courses, and I think you make a really great case for the argument that the PDB has been tailored to every president and has worked for most of them, those who actually took advantage of the CIA's efforts. Were ultimately successful. And so, certainly your work has influenced the way I have thought about the intelligence debates. I also wanted to give a shout out to an article that appeared actually in Lawfare, I believe in 2020, that I can't remember the author's name, but the question was Wilmore Kendall right? And he sort of questioned whether Kendall really had the right approach to intelligence analysis. As we know, Sherman Kent, a social scientist, privileged positivism, privileged objective analysis in analytical products. And Kendall basically said, well, is that even possible? And should that be the objective of the analyst? And I think for a great many years, many historians have kind of overlooked his argument. But I think the last 20 years, maybe going back a little bit farther, has really shown the extent to which intelligence analysts have to deal with politicization in different ways. And while the analysts have gone through much more structured training, the issue of politicization hasn't gone away. And so I'm wondering, do we need to find new ways of thinking about politicization beyond the traditional social science methods that we seem to rely on over and over again?
Fascinating. Thank you. I'll ask you to follow up by taking us forward in time. So what tends to stick in the popular imagination of the CIA from the 1950s through the 1970s are things like illegal wiretaps and drug experiments and regime change efforts gone wrong. How much do these aberrations from the core missions of the CIA, how much do they define it for that entire period? And as a historian, how much are they distractions for those who are seeking to study the bulk of the CIA effort across many decades? And instead, it always keeps coming back to these abject failures.
Well, here I'm going to turn to Amy Zeitgart and her wonderful new book, Spies, Lies, and Algorithms. And I'm going to paraphrase her here. Basically, what she says in her book is, where there's no history, imaginations run wild. What she argues is that a lack of education about intelligence in the United States has allowed fictional accounts to become the dominant way Americans think about their history. And I think that over the last 20 or 30 years, the CIA has learned better than most that it's better to play an active role in constructing its own image than leaving a vacuum. And so over the last 20 years, they've played a very active role in working with movies and working with TV shows. However, we come back to Zeitgart, who argues depiction is shoddy education. In order to educate the public, right, to get rid of some of these mythic stories that take us beyond what the CIA actually accomplished and can do, we need better histories. Arguably, there's been a much more considerate history of the agency since the 1990s than there was before. And it was in the 1990s that the CIA began a program to declassify a significant amount of documents. And here I want to publicly single out Robert Gates, who was DCI at the time. He set up the Gates Commission on Openness in 1991. Now, it's taken over 30 years for us to get some of the documents that he talked about in the 1990s released. And some of them are still not released, but we were moving in the right direction. A lot of PhDs were written, a lot of very serious history about the CIA, including my own work, was the result of Gates' commitment to opening records. And I think we have a much better understanding of the CIA because of it. Now, having said that, I also have to say, unfortunately today, I think we're moving backwards. Our declassification system is broken. Historians are struggling to access the documents they need to write their history. And the government has even started to reclassify documents that were already available. Frankly, this is silly. If you look at the histories of the agencies, such as they were in the 1970s, they were written by people who had an axe to grind, either for or against the CIA. The same argument can be made about some of the contemporary accounts today. But the histories that have been released because of declassifications, and this work was largely done by CIA history staff, so I want to call them out for all of their hard work over the years, they've really given us a more complex understanding of the agency. We no longer have heroes and villains, but rather people trying to do a job they were tasked to do under very difficult circumstances, and people who emerged and followed the reigning ideology and the cultural climate in which they lived. Those are the stories of the CIA that we should be telling, and we need documents to do it.
Rhodri, I want to get your perspective on the same thing, because let me put this delicately. You have been researching and writing about things related to American intelligence and related issues for much of the CIA's history, and you've had the ability to see how access to documents and how the culture around writing about the Central Intelligence Agency has changed across several decades. So give us your perspective on that. What is the trend line, and is it changing in terms of both direction and intensity over the past several decades in terms of the ability to reckon with the CIA's history with some level of accuracy and real research?
I think you opened this section of our discussion by mentioning things like regime change and the impact that might have had on people's perception of the CIA. So if I might address that to begin with, I think the regime change is something that the American public weren't terribly aware of in the 1950s. People in other countries had a very good idea of what the CIA was up to, but I don't think that it had much coverage in the United States, and indeed foreign events generally, whether about what the CIA does or what other agencies or other sections of the government do, don't really stir the American public. What really matters is whether one's own ox has been gored. So it takes a domestic scandal really to arouse public opinion, so we really see people getting worked up about the CIA when, for example, the voluntary sector is used. For example, the National Student Association, and although they're used for events overseas, they have an impact back home on American opinion, because these are American students who are being asked to do these things. And the investigation of the protest movement against the Vietnam War was another event that had a major impact on public opinion. Now, when we come on to the attitude of historians, I mean, historians are creatures of their times, and many historians who have studied the history of the CIA have been liberal in their disposition and politics, and they have been influenced by the domestic transgressions of the CIA, but have broadened the agenda to take in perceived transgressions of the agencies and other countries. At the same time, of course, there is the defensive history being written both by official historians, although official historians can be pretty critical. For example, if you look at the official reports on the Bay of Pigs episode, that's a critical report. Nevertheless, there's an underlying tendency to be loyal to the agency and to put the agency's point of view. As to broader developments over time, I think that the currents in the historiography of the CIA tend to follow the currents in the historiography of American foreign policy. So you have schools of thought such as the New Left, revisionism, neoconservatism, and so on. And I see not much to separate the two disciplines in that regard.
Thank you very much. I do appreciate that. And we focused a little bit in this segment on, the things that went wrong, whether it's Bay of Pigs or the way that we're remembering certain failures of CIA operations, or frankly, guidance from policymakers that the CIA was asked to execute. But there have also been successes. So Sarah Jane, which pieces of conventional wisdom about the CIA's successes over the decades? And this can range from anything from, predicting in advance that there would be a coup attempt against Gorbachev, to the finding of Osama bin Laden. You pick whatever it is. What successes of the CIA that are touted over the years are most correct, and or are they mostly exaggerated almost as a counter effect to the failures?
That's a tough question. Which successes?
We could always bring up the old line that intelligence officers often use with a lament, which is, it seems like there are never any intelligence successes. There are only intelligence failures and policy successes, because anything intelligence does right is to enable policy, and therefore the policy makers get credit for it. But there are certainly many things that intelligence officers have done either analytically or on the operations side to enable successful policies, things that generally went better than they could have in American history because of the adequate, at a minimum, and in some cases superior provision of intelligence to policymakers.
Yeah, I think, I think if I could pick one example, it would probably be the Cuban Missile Crisis. And it would probably be the extended effort by John McCone to make sure there was another overflight of Cuba when nobody thought the Soviets were going to put missiles in Cuba. So I think that's a piece where there's a definite success in terms of American intelligence. It's really hard to come up with a lot of different successes because we don't have the information we need to make those kind of judgments, right? We know about the failures. We have tons of anecdotal evidence, newspaper articles about operations that have failed. What we don't have is good historical analysis of things that worked. So certainly, the capture and the death of Osama bin Laden, of course, on the surface, success. But we don't know what everything that went behind that decision. There's a lot we don't know about that decision, right? So if I had to pick one, I would go to the Cuban Missile Crisis and John McCone's decision. This guy was on his honeymoon, right? And he's on his honeymoon and he's literally cabling Kennedy. You need to do one more overflight. You need to do this. And Kennedy's doing everything he possibly can to put him off. And finally, Kennedy just says, fine, let's do it. And they find them. Yeah. Right. So, and again, you look at the photographic evidence that was developed over time to be able to do that. Right. So again, example of a big success. So. Yeah.
Rhodri, your book provides an overview of CIA history, and that includes failures and successes. So what stands out to you as one or more of the greatest successes in CIA history?
Well, I could list a number of successes, but I think what you were driving at was, what does the public see as some of its great successes? And I have to agree with Sarah Jane there that the Cuban Missile Crisis is seen as a great success. It's not just the intervention of John McCone, but the capability of the CIA in organizing U-2 overflights, the information at the disposal of the CIA secretly obtained, which enabled them to analyze the significance of missile sites on the island of Cuba. And I think that that's been fairly well ventilated, and quite a few people would have a good idea of that as being a success and the reasons for it. The detection of Osama bin Laden, I think that's another good example. Quite a few examples you might think of are controversial, such as, for example, the Iran estimate of 2007, which questioned the existence of a nuclear program, an advanced nuclear program in that country. I mean, one might consider that to be a considerable success, and also an example of speaking truth to power, because it went against the grain of Bush administration foreign policy at that point. But one would have to point out that that's quite a controversial view. So are you looking for unanimity or not? I think that as a generalization also, one could offer the view that most people believe that the CIA is an essential ingredient in national security. And most people realize that you can't explain all the time why this is the case, because of the nature of the beast that you're looking at. Even if you speak to doubters, people who are highly critical of the CIA, and you ask them, well, look, these are the dangers that confront the world at the moment. Would you like to have no CIA? Would you like to scrap it? And all of a sudden, doubt appears in that person's eyes. So it's not just specific instance, but the overall approach to the issue. I mean, there is a disposition in the public to exaggerate and distort the nature of the business that the CIA is going. I mean, if you visit Langley, there's a shortage of James Bonds in evidence, and if you look at the popular media and the way in which people think that CIA operates, they sometimes have that misconception. I think that sometimes the public is in error as to the nature of the CIA's achievements. For example, most people would go along with the view that when the CIA aims at regime change, it's on the principle that quite apart from questions of national interest and security, it's on the principle that the CIA, that the United States is not like dictatorships, and that's regime change often aims at democracy. That's a reason for public approval of the way in which the CIA operates, but very often founded on misconceptions, because that's not always the case in practice.
Yeah. Well, both of you collectively have given me some food for thought here, because I find myself sitting here thinking about it and realizing, there are a few success stories in the popular imagination. Some have been made into movies. There's Argo, which is the case of the intelligence operation that helped to get Americans out of Iran with the crucial help of the Canadian government and some crucial policy decisions from politicians in the US.
David, you mean the Canadian caper?
The Canadian, yeah, there you go. There's definitely a framing issue here that we can have a good conversation about. But definitely, there are a few of those, but very few. And part of that is inherent in the bias of intelligence operators. When they do an operation and it works well, they don't want to publicize it so that they can use the same techniques again, whereas failures often are public, and that's what makes them a failure. So there's an inherent bias there. And of course, we also have a bias towards what actually happened versus what didn't happen, the counterfactual. So why is it we're not sitting here talking about the failures of the communist takeover of Italy and Spain early in the Cold War, or the India-Pakistan nuclear war of 1996 or 1997? It's because those things didn't happen. Now, to what extent intelligence contributed to policy which prevented those things from happening, that's a very hard thing to tease out as a historian, but that's why you two have the hard jobs, because you have to dig into those questions and try to give us some insight into those. We've barely touched on some of the organizational matters of the CIA and the intelligence community in the United States, frankly, because they're not as interesting stories to many people as the actual foreign policy stories. But I think we have to, at least when it comes to the creation of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, almost 20 years ago now, believe it or not. Sarah Jane, first, your thoughts on the creation of the ODNI and whether the CIA itself was fundamentally changed in some way because of that, based on your perspective, studying it from the outside.
So that's an interesting question. I find that whenever we start talking about intelligence reform, like the 2004 Act or the reform that came after the 1970s, it's not so much that intelligence itself is reformed, but it just gets bigger. And so I'm wondering if perhaps we need to reframe the way we think about these questions, right? And here I want to come back to the point that I opened with, and that is we can't look at the CIA in isolation. The CIA does not exist in a vacuum. It's a tool of the American government, and it's a tool of the American people. And you all need to own that. So if you're not happy with the reform of the agency, and again, I mean, the intelligence community has become so large And it seems to me that we are still dealing with the same issues that we were dealing with to some extent in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and today. If you're not happy with what the agency is doing, we have to ask ourselves, is it an agency problem? Is it a government problem? Or is it an American problem? A long time ago, a historian by the name of William Appleton Williams wrote a hugely influential book, and he called it The Tragedy of American Diplomacy. He argued the tragedy was not American objectives, which he believed were noble, but the means or the tools by which the United States tried to achieve these aims. The CIA is one of those tools. Now, Williams wasn't talking about intelligence when he wrote that book, but he was asking Americans to confront what their overall objectives were. And so if you want to think about reform of the agency, it's not something you can do by investigating the 2004 Act. It's not something you can do by investigating the Church Committee Act. You have to think about what America is today and what it's become.
Right, right. Rhodri, you make the point in your new book that the ODNI did take away some of CIA's prized control over things like the president's daily brief, and that was somewhat of a morale hit because some of the original functioning of the CIA was designed to be the funnel of intelligence to the president of the United States. And now there's a different bureaucratic entity in the way. So reflecting on Sarah Jane's comments about the overall operation of the US government and the control of the CIA as one of the points in that whole constellation, what do you think about that? What do you think about the idea that, in fact, yes, there might be some bureaucratic grumbling about it, but it's still serving its fundamental purpose as part of this ever expanding intelligence community?
I think the act was demoralizing for people in the CIA. I mean, I talked to people who were very well informed, I thought, yet said, we don't understand what's going on. And it was demoralizing partly because it came about because of demoralizing reasons. The CIA was made a scapegoat for recent events in American history for questionable, unquestionable logic. The CIA obviously made mistakes, so does every agency, but the CIA wasn't alone at fault for the 9/11 attack, and wasn't alone at fault for the weapons of mass destruction era. But nevertheless, someone had to take the blame. Otherwise, the blame would attach to the administration, bluntly, and the CIA took the hit. And I think people in the CIA recognize that, and there was a lot of grumbling about it. The CIA, you mentioned the president's daily brief, and this is the case, although I understand from talking to people since then that the CIA does have a very good input into that still. The other aspect of it was that the director of the CIA is no longer the director in charge of the intelligence community as a whole, and someone else has taken on that role. I think the jury is out on that one. So far, we haven't had a major disaster, but if one occurs, we can be sure that the 2004 Act will be revisited. Picking up one point that Sarah Jane was saying, the intelligence community is enormous, and it gives you a huge problem of management. Joining at the dots, that famous phrase, one wonders whether it's been made easier or not by the reconstruction of the intelligence community since 9/11. But on the size, pure and simple, when George Washington was president, he had a contingency fund for espionage purposes, which took up 12% of the national budget. The CIA is an ingredient in the intelligence community, and the intelligence community takes up 10% of the national security or defense budget, of which the CIA gets a generous but much smaller amount of money. So, but compared with the expenditure in what George Washington's day, you could argue that it's modest. And when you consider the size of the United States, the extent of the responsibilities that the United States has to face, it may not be an immodestly sized intelligence community, but that still doesn't get away from the point. It's extremely difficult to manage, and joining the dots still remains a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always struck by that statistic from the George Washington era of the relative size of the contingency funds for covert operations, until I realized that the United States government at the time was not recognizable to modern eyes, because there was a Department of War, a Department of State, a Department of Treasury, perhaps, and an Attorney General, but not even a Justice Department, much less Department of Agriculture, Department of Energy, and all of these things. Let's go to some questions from our attendees, and these will bounce around a bit, but I think it'll foster some good conversation here between you. So Danielle Green has an interesting question, pulling all this together, and it's better than what I was going to do. So we're going to run with it, Danielle. From the perspective, the often, misattributed or misused quote of those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. What are your observations? First, Sarah Jane, then Rhodri. What are your observations about any of the elements in the CIA's history repeating themselves? Are the people involved with intelligence decisions and the political leaders involved in directing intelligence decisions, are they actually learning from the CIA's past and avoiding making the same mistakes? Or are we seeing more of a cyclical pattern of some of the same types of mistakes being made? First to you, Sarah Jane, and then Rhodri as well.
Well, here I have to actually go to Rhodri, because he makes this point in his book, and I think he makes it very effectively, that the events that occur around Pearl Harbor are never going to occur again. You're never going to have that exact same situation. So if we keep thinking that we can learn from our mistakes, then I think like the lessons we learned from Pearl Harbor, you make this point, Rhodri, are not the lessons that we learned from 9/11. So I don't think of history as something that allows us to learn lessons in order to understand the present or the future. That's not how I envision history.
Yeah. Rhodri.
Well, I tend to look at it in terms of the political context in which the CIA has operated. And one repeating pattern, I think, is, as I mentioned earlier, the CIA, and especially the director of the CIA, tends to be the scapegoat when things go wrong. And there's a famous saying by John F. Kennedy when he was asking Dulles to go, that if this were the United Kingdom, the Prime Minister would have to resign. But this is the United States and you have to go. And that this has continued to be the case. And if you're looking for repetition, I think this has happened on a number of occasions, the scapegoat pattern. The other tendency is that when the CIA is judged to have got things wrong, the tendency of the administration's response is to reward success, to say, the CIA got this wrong because they didn't have enough money. Let's give them more assets, which I find a very interesting way of going about things. Another political stroke intelligence issue is the way in which intelligence is used in international diplomacy. I'm thinking of two cases. First, Kissinger's manipulation of intelligence leading to the SALT I agreement in the Nixon presidency, where essentially the CIA was saying, you can't trust the Russians, the Soviet Union, I should say, for that period. You can't trust the Soviets because they never live up to the agreements they make, and you have to be very careful. And when Kissinger was trying to persuade the Senate to accept the proposals he'd worked out with the Russians, with the Soviet Union, he just buried that information and kept it from not just the American public, but from the United States Senate, which has responsibility in foreign policy. And you could make the argument that, was it a lesson to be learned there? Well, I think when you look at the A-team, B-team experiments. People had realized by then what tricks Kissinger had played, tricks perhaps in a good cause, but tricks nevertheless. And there was a disposition to challenge that by the A-team, B-team mechanism. But once again, in the 1980s, there's a disposition to manipulate intelligence on the Soviet Union in order to persuade the Senate once again, and the Congress as a whole, that it's worth spending money on the strategic defense initiative, with in mind the objective that by adopting that policy, you'll give the Soviet Union the choice, either emulate and ruin your country, or concede that you can no longer compete in the arms race, and it would then be in their interest to come to the negotiating table and negotiate an arms reduction, and that's what happened. Now, that of course is an expression of the victory thesis, and not everybody agrees with the victory thesis. But it's quite interesting to see that pattern repeating in the history of the CIA. Although you could argue that this is a pattern that is successful. No doubt that patterns leading to failure as well. Yeah.
Sarah Jane?
But patterns aren't the same as lessons, are they? Right?
Yeah, they can be, but they're not necessarily so.
Yeah.
Yeah. It would be interesting to see, because I was struck as you were saying that, Rhodri, that one of the most interesting times that you highlighted early on for the Central Intelligence Agency was after the fall of the Soviet Union, when you had someone as prominent as Senator Moynihan calling for the CIA to go away. We don't need it anymore. And yet it stuck around, and many people saw the need for it. And it wasn't too many years later when there was a massive refunding of the CIA because there had been a few years of cuts, and people realized that, well, when you need intelligence is when it's not obvious what the threat is, and you need to be looking at a wider variety of issues. So in a sense, there is a cyclical flow of when there seems to be a sense of, if not calm, at least stability internationally, that you can, in a sense, pull back a little bit on the throttle of intelligence. And yet it doesn't always play out that way, because it's not all about perceptions of stability. There's a whole lot of people with agency around the world doing things that they want to do that affect events much more so than the bureaucracy. There
are new threats on the horizon all the time.
Yeah.
And I think it's worth bearing in mind also that old threats can recur. For example, immediately after the 9/11 attack, there was a request out for people to volunteer to go and work in counterintelligence. And I was speaking to somebody who's in charge of the Russian division of Peter Clements, who was in charge of Russian division in the CIA at the time. And he said that he managed to hold on to the real specialists, but those who had what you call transferable skills,
they all went to counterterrorism,
moved over to counterterrorism. Now that could have been very damaging,
right?
But he managed to hold on to a sufficient core. So today, I think we do have a competent Russian capacity. Fortunately, the current director of the CIA is just the man for the job at the moment, having been ambassador to Moscow and so on.
Yeah.
So you know, when you move on, and there's a new threat, you've got to be careful that you don't abandon the old expertise.
Right. Both Anderson Miles and Barry Smith in the Q&A have asked a question about information sharing and how that has changed over the years. Now, you've looked very extensively, Sarah Jane, at the early operations of the CIA and the Truman era in particular. And correct me if I'm wrong, but the information sharing, even within what the small CIA, was abysmal, and the information sharing between agencies was pretty dismal as well. Over time, it may have improved, but it has gone through ups and downs over time, both between agencies and within the CIA itself. So what are your overall thoughts on information sharing, and whether in fact the reforms of the last 15 plus years have in fact changed that overall for the better, despite just the expansion that the ODNI created? Did it help with the information sharing as part of its creation?
Oh, absolutely. One of the things that I find the most ironic when I look back at America's first covert operations is the analytical branch was saying one thing and the operations people were going in the exact opposite direction. There was no communication at all between the two branches. I would argue that, many of the early covert operations might not have been so damaging to both the countries they were taking place in and to Americans at home, if there had been more of a dialogue between the analysts and the operators. And I think we see this with the hunt for bin Laden, with the search for Al-Qaeda, the development of the organization itself within the counterterrorism branch, the operations and the analysts working together appear to have worked together much more effectively in some cases later on than they did in the early history of the agency. I'm just going to have to excuse myself for 1 minute. I sincerely apologize. Be right back.
Absolutely. Now, Rhodri, you get your chance to say something Sarah Jane wouldn't like because she won't hear you and respond. But on the issue of information sharing, in your broad sweep of agency history across 200 plus pages in your new book, it is one of the issues that comes up is how is information passed around? And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that because of the commentary you offer around the morale hit that the CIA took with the creation of the Director of National Intelligence. But there is the work benefit, if you will, of smart analysts in various agencies, in some cases being forced to work together through intelligence integration efforts. So despite the morale hit you described, is in fact CIA analysis and analysis of the other intelligence agencies better because that information sharing and opinion sharing is raising the level so that all boats are rising?
Well, I think it's a genetic problem to do with human nature. Information is power, and there's a constant power struggle going on in Washington, D.C. So there's a natural tendency to monopolize power in the interest of monopolize information in order to increase your own power. So it is a genetic problem. As for the post-1904 situation, I talked to quite a few people, and maybe I got a skewed view of this. I talked to a number of former directors of the National Intelligence Council, and the feeling there was, of course, that's an institution with a long history, which goes right back to the Second World War, in fact. But it's now an organism with an enhanced function. And people who have been in it for some time say that there was a resentment at the fact that the CIA always called the shots on the National Intelligence Council. But now they're able to call in experts from all walks of life, not just other government agencies. But if they need someone with expertise, they can call them in to help with a national estimate. So that's a very promising development, right, if you listen to the people concerned. Mm-hmm. But again, time will tell.
Right. Thank you. Sarah Jane, you weren't away long, but in the first 30 seconds before you came back on, we resolved all issues ever related to intelligence history. So everything's fine now.
Fabulous. Thank you.
Yeah, that's what we do. I did want to ask both of you one other question here, and it's an interesting one because the whole idea of secret intelligence in a generally open society is a fraught one, and it leads to tensions on both sides. So besides the classification, the declassification of documents, what do you think would help with more openness? What could a secret intelligence agency do beyond declassifying more? Sarah Jane, you've made a compelling case for that. And then now, of course, they're engaging on social media and doing more public events. But what else could contribute to a culture of openness, given that some of the work must remain secret? I'll take your view, Sarah Jane, and then Rhodri as well.
Actually, I've given some thought to this, and I've had two wonderful examples recently where we've approached openness in different ways. And the first is a collaborative project that I'm working on with two former agency analysts. And we're working on a book chapter together. And we've been able to write the history in a different way. And they provided me, and without giving away classified information or anything like that, but really a different way of thinking about the process. I also had a phenomenal experience when I was asked a friend of mine to give a lecture on one of my courses, and then she asked me to give one in her, and she's a former intelligence analyst, and we worked on the Bay of Pigs lecture together. And the way she approached it and the way I approached it were two totally different ways, and I learned so much from her. So those type of collaborative projects I think are fabulous, and I would like to see historians and former officers work together more often than they do in the writing of history. The other one occurred just last week. I was really fortunate to have Dr. Nicholas Reynolds, who's also wrote a fantastic new book on the Office of Strategic Services. And he came into my classroom and talked to my grad students about his book, but also answered a lot of questions that they had. And he, again, was able to provide them with different types of information than I ever could. And so he made the suggestion afterwards that we should really, set up an organization where intelligence officers agree to go into classrooms to talk to graduate students, to talk to them about what that experience is like. So I think, aside from declassification of documents, which, is always at the foremost of my mind, there are other ways that historians and practitioners can work together to write and create and think about better histories.
Yep. And let me add to that to address the comment from Mark Lowenthal in the chat box. Thank you, Mark. That I would argue that it's not simply to provide historians with footnotes, that the idea of more openness about the intelligence community is in a democratic representative society to have more buy-in from the public, because it's hard to have a secret organization in an open society where the public has no window into what's going on and the elected representatives have no window into what's going on. And some of the tensions that Rhodri writes about ably in his new book do deal with some of those tensions with the standing of the United States intelligence community in the eyes of Congress and in the eyes of the American people. But that's a whole other conversation to have about the entire openness debate going on. But Rhodri, a closing comment on that or another point before we wrap up our event this evening?
Well, I think we should ask the White Cat really to comment on that. I'm not quite sure that it's up to the CIA to determine policies on openness. I think the Bob Gates may have come up with some initiatives, but I think that the initiative chiefly comes from politicians. For example, President George W. Bush prominently advocated greater openness. Daniel Moynihan, although he advocated the abolition of the CIA, was also perhaps more so an advocacy of openness in government, and he had a great influence. I wonder if greater confidence would be created on this subject if people were more secure about the methods used to secure secrecy, where it's strictly necessary. Just to give one example, do we really need an intelligence committee in each of the houses of Congress? Or would it be a good idea to take up an idea mooted in the 1970s and have a single joint committee? The fewer people you have, the more secure you are in your confidence that the secrets will be kept. And if you're certain that the real secrets will be kept, you'll be happier dispensing other kinds of information.
Fascinating idea. Sarah Jane, Rhodri, thank you very much. I'm going to pass it back to Larry for a quick closing comment.
Well, I'm going to take a host prerogative and ask one more question. And both of you can feel free to answer it however you'd like. But often history is defined by personalities, and CIA has been led by a number of outsized or perhaps not outsized personalities. How much do you believe the personalities have defined different eras of CIA's history, or would you argue that the bureaucracy of CIA ultimately defines what they do? Over to Sarah Jane, why don't you go first?
What a great question. And as soon as you asked the question, I'm sitting there nodding and saying absolutely. And I'm thinking of Chris Andrews' fabulous book For the President's Eyes Only, where he talks about, the significance of the DCI and the presidents and how that relationship is critical to understanding how the intelligence community evolved. But then I'm sitting back and thinking, but the bureaucracy really does play a role as well. And I'm much more comfortable talking about some of the bureaucratic issues that arose during the 1940s and the 1950s, where you can see bureaucratic conflicts, turf wars, playing an oversized role that actually dwarfs the presidential DCI relationship. So both, I think, play a role. I'd like to see more done, of course, on different presidents as we move through history. I'd like, more documents available to look at bureaucratic history, because I actually think it's fascinating. I know I'm probably in the minority on that, but I really think, and this is, one of the things about writing the history of the CIA is that it's sometimes easier to start with the bureaucracy, even if you're working on covert operations, because understanding the bureaucracy gives you the tools necessary to understand who was doing what, when, and where. And so that bureaucratic history is critical. It's a great question.
And Rhodri?
Yeah, I think personalities are important, as is the context in which they operate. Chris Andrews made the point, for example, that you can't do very much if the president is not a sympathetic person or is not very competent when it comes to understanding intelligence matters. But to take a couple of examples, Alan Dulles, who I think he made mistakes, of course, but he was a pretty effective leader. There was a special circumstance which helped him a great deal, I think, which was that his brother was Secretary of State. That can be a difficult relationship, but clearly things worked fine in the 1950s, not just because of Alan Dulles' personality, but because of his very good connection. In the case of the current director of the CIA, I think he gets on very well with the president, and I think a sign of that is the way in which he made his unhappiness known at the speed with which the United States withdrew from Afghanistan, because he thought that the intelligence fallout of that was not good. He made his views known, remained in office. That's a good sign.
Well, thank you for indulging me with the extra question. I'd like to again echo David's comments and thank both of you for joining us. It's later at night for both of you, much later at night for you, Rhodri. Time for a nightcap. David, thank you again for a wonderful moderation. The comments that came through the chat and through other social media have all been just glowing about the discussion tonight. So thank you again. And on behalf of Dean Mark Rozelle and General Hayden, I'd like to thank the audience for sticking with us, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you all very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you all.
Good night.